Rashida, thanks so much for talking to FemLink Pacific. Maybe if I could ask you to reflect on your role as the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women for the United Nations, because yesterday, as the Commonwealth Secretary-General spoke at the opening of the side event, the knowledge-sharing event, I was struck by the fact that she said that one of the things that connects us as members of the Commonwealth, in fact, members of the United Nations as well, is the pervasive nature of violence against women. You have obviously seen this very close up as the Special Rapporteur. What were the main trends that you were seeing, particularly in terms of not just the fact that there is violence, but how is the legislator, the judiciary, even the police responding to the prevalence of violence against women in our world?
Thank you. Thank you very much. To start off with, I think the acknowledgement that violence against women is the most pervasive human rights violation that we face today, whether in times of peace or conflict or transitions or displacements, is a huge sign that we know there's something wrong with our world when over half the world's population is being subjected to violence in one form or the other. The challenge has been that within the international system, the development of normative frameworks to address it, to provide guidelines, to provide technical assistance has happened. Regional human rights system, the African, the European, the Inter-American system have developed either specific mechanisms to address it or more generally through jurisprudence. At a national level, I think the challenge has been how do we domesticate these obligations that governments sign on to, that agree to. And this would apply in the violence against women sector, particularly when it comes to legislative normative frameworks. My take after 6 years is sometimes there's the lack of political will to acknowledge that this is a human rights violation, a lack of understanding that this is a human rights issue, that it isn't a social welfare issue, this isn't a charity issue, this is not something that happens to poor black women and we don't have to worry too much about it. This is a human rights issue, and if we understood and if we acknowledge, understood, and accepted that, then we have to start thinking about remedies in a different way. So that's one of the problems. In countries where there is an acknowledgement that this is a human rights violation, the trend has been to look at laws and policies and not to allocate budgets for the effective implementation of remedies and redress measures. And that's also a challenge. In other contexts, there is a political will, there is technical assistance to develop good normative frameworks, but there aren't resources, human and financial resources. And so the dependency is on civil society, particularly the women's rights sector or international agencies. And when we have that kind of dependency, then we sometimes forget that the state is the ultimate duty bearer. The state has a responsibility. My argument in context when the resource constraint issue comes up is that why is it that we never have this conversation on resource constraints when it comes to military spending? But when it comes to social spending, when it comes to spending on women and children, addressing vulnerabilities, the budget and resource issue comes up. But it doesn't come up necessarily when we're allocating military budgets.
There's been a lot of investment, if you want, just, reflecting on the RRT presentation at the knowledge sharing event on legal literacy. Right. So you could say, even just for my region here in the Pacific, women do know there is this thing called CEDAW. It's a convention on women's human rights. We're doing work, for example, on UNSCR 1325, and as you rightly put, women demand human security first, rather than traditional security. But how do we then really utilize these tools in a way to get that accountability from the state, regardless of who gets elected,
That is the challenge, the throwing the baby out of the bathwater scenario when you have a change in government. I think the fact that legal literacy is playing a big role, in a sense, it can be seen as a glass half empty, which is we give women tools through legal literacy, and then the system and the institution fails them. So we raise expectations. On the other hand, and the other argument is, if they don't have the legal tools, if they don't know what their rights are, then how do they exercise the rights, and how do they hold the state accountable? One of the things that I have constantly stressed to civil society is that you need to develop the tools to hold your government accountable. Because as citizens, you have a responsibility. You've put these people in power through your vote. Maybe not. And so how do you hold them accountable? So one is data gathering, keeping statistics to show prevalence, manifestations, to monitor the functioning, whether it's effective implementation of legislation, the kind of jurisprudence that comes out of your country. But it's really hard for civil society, who are service providers, because now we're asking them to do service provision, which the state is not doing. We're asking them to do research. We're asking them to do data collection. We're asking them to contribute submissions to policies and laws. And in a context where they have limited resources, I think we're asking a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And so the international NGOs then come in and do this sort of work, which in the eyes of a national government, it's not seen as legitimate, because you're the outsiders, and what do you know about this? In the eyes of the local community, it's very valuable, because at least it frees them to continue with their service provision. The other thing that I think for civil society my message would be is, when you dive in to do the counseling, the legal aid, the shelter services, you do it because there is a need. Someone has to do it. But what you forget to do in that context is remember that the state is the ultimate duty bearer. You're not the duty bearer. So if you don't simultaneously say to the state, what are you doing? Because this is your responsibility, the service provision. We're not asking you as the state to do it directly. We're asking you as the state to provide the resources so we as the experts with the experience can do this, instead of being held to ransom by donor funding, which comes from external sources, and then we're accused of having Western-driven agendas or whatever. And so it is a challenge for civil society that they're trying to address the needs which are there, because the state is not fulfilling its role, or fulfilling it in a way that is not holistic, substantive, remedial, and they don't have the resources and time to do the accountability work, which is keeping the information in a way, the empirical evidence which shows that the state is failing in its obligations. So there is that. There is the other trend that I saw over the 6 years, which is the need to be seen as supporting the state. So not holding the state accountable and doing the work of the state. And if you do the work of the state then abdicates its responsibility, right? And I'm not saying that every state has all the resources that are needed. What I'm saying is, when we don't have that element in our thinking, that we're not the state owes us a responsibility and an obligation, then we sometimes take over as civil society. I've seen civil society come to the international, to UN meetings, the CSW, General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and they're very vocal. They make submissions, they come. And then I ask myself, what happens when you go back home? Where's the global local link? You can make a submission to CEDAW. After CEDAW has examined your country report, CEDAW comes up with concluding observations. How do you bring that back home? How do you, in the next 4 years, before the next country report comes out, how do you monitor whether your state is actually meeting. And now with the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review process, how do you do? That's all part of accountability. It's not rocket science. It's sort of the simple things. If I'm going to make a submission to an international body or a regional human rights body, what is my responsibility to do the follow-up, to check if my government is meeting its obligations? So for me, accountability in the 6 years, I have argued that impunity is the norm for crimes against women and girl children in particular. And we need to make accountability the norm. And yes, some of the UN agencies have developed the tools that would allow both government and the non-state and the state sector to kind of monitor developments. But then when you do a review and you're reporting, it feels like it's not real accountability. And yes, I know it has to be a dialogue between the states and civil society and other role players. But if it's a dialogue, you don't go back with the message that this is about state responsibility to act with due diligence. And so we continue to see levels of violence rising because impunity is the norm rather than accountability. I wrote a whole report on how violence against women is a barrier to the exercise of all human rights, but it's also a barrier to me being an effective citizen, right? If violence is part of the equation, then I cannot be an effective citizen contributing to my family, my community, my country, And so the understandings are there, but my overall sense is that we're not reaching a point of substantive, effective, remedial work, preventative work, responses, etc. Because somewhere in the psyche there's still a thinking that what happens to women is not as important as what happens between strangers out on the street. So if the justice system diverts matters out of the system, if the police respond in a way that pushes women to go back home and kiss and make up or whatever, or treat sexual violence victims as having asked for it, whether because they were out somewhere or dressed in a certain way, if the prosecution services doesn't do its work properly of holding the police accountable to get the evidence to be able to successfully prosecute, if judges don't give adequate sentences and sanctions that send a message to society, then the system falls apart and fewer and fewer women use the system. And for me, it's a huge source of concern that we talk about discrimination against women, but we don't address the discrimination in access to justice for women because it fails at every level, from the police right up to, So the state structures in terms of accountability are failing women. When we divert matters out of the system and then we don't see the woman, we assume that everything's fine, that she's not being violated. In fact, she knows the response she's going to get. She's not going to come back to the system to use the system, is she? And I think turning these conversations on their heads, asking the question, because yesterday listening to one of the judges about these diversion programs, it struck me, if you're not seeing repeat victimization, it's not because it's not happening. It's because she knows if she comes to the system is going to deal with the matter in this particular way. And so we need to turn the question around and say, what is it that serves as a barrier to women coming out and using or coming out into the public domain or standing for political office? What are the barriers? And the public-private dichotomy is alive and well. The patriarchy is alive and well. We know that. We know in some contexts there's a benevolent patriarchy, under the guise of this is our culture, this is our religion, this is our tradition. It's no one's culture, religion, tradition to violate women or to treat them as second-class citizens. And so there's this benevolence now that we're also seeing. And, I am a lawyer. Accountability is important to me, but there's a different nuance to accountability that we need to talk about. And we need to hold each other accountable. So in the 6 years, during my country investigations, during my interactions with civil society, one of the things that I would do is question civil society, question UN agencies, question government. So although my investigation was about the country, there are all these role players
connections
that you can't just talk to the state, and you have to question civil society. So you go into a shelter, you see certain practices, you interview the victims in shelters, and something doesn't sit right, and so you ask the people who run shelters, is your philosophy one of a welfare approach, that you're just providing a shelter, doing counseling, and then saying we're keeping her safe here? Or is it more of a feminist, where you think about what are the empowerment tools that this woman needs? What can we do to facilitate the state-citizen relationship in this instance? Because with this level of vulnerability, it does, violence incapacitates some women, and they're unable to see the wood for the trees.
So I want to pick up on that, if I may, just in terms of state-citizen relationship and accountability, because as we sit here, ahead of the Women's Ministerial meeting, we've now seen the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. And yes, we have Goal 5, but we also have Goal 16, and within that, as you've talked about, the connection to women's leadership. The conference here is also talking about women's economic or entrepreneurship. So in moving forward, this, if you want, the pervasive agenda of the prevalence of violence, and we've got these lovely commitments again in the Sustainable Development Goals to 2030. How do we, I'll talk about my work, for a rural woman in a community that's just been badly affected by a Category 5 cyclone. So it was bad enough before. Now the state being accountable to her needs, her protection issues, but also her development priorities, her economic priorities? How do we make that connection, that that the state is not waiting for, as you said, that woman to come and report if she feels confident enough, but also that the state also has that accountability to her economic security, which could be the cause of the violence to start off with?
Yeah, and it could be the cause of her remaining in the abusive relationship. And that's where I've argued that we need a holistic approach. So we need the justice approach. There is no way that we can do accountability without the justice approach, because the justice system can send a message. This is not normal. This is not acceptable, etc., as we heard yesterday. In terms of economic needs, the state needs to think about housing. So shelters and emergency relief, what do we do about second stage housing? The state has a responsibility to that. The state has a responsibility if it's someone who, because of her circumstances, poverty, inability to get educated, the state has a responsibility to think about her needs in terms of education, skills development. Is she viable? I saw a project in Algeria on my country mission to Algeria, where women who went into the shelters, and this was generic, it wasn't just domestic violence shelters, women who didn't have any family to support them, etc., or had mental health issues, so were put into this, went into a shelter service. And when they went in there, I had never seen so many trained psychologists in a shelter setting in my life ever. Because you normally see social workers, you see volunteers, because that's the nature, because of the lack of funding. But counseling, therapeutic intervention, skills development or continuing education was part of the program, and it was voluntary, women could. When they felt they were ready, the state had the second stage housing program for them. The state put women who had gone through a skills development or tertiary education project on a roster, so when a government job came up, they had preference, the women who were in the shelters. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a model of thinking holistically, right? So you think of, she gets out of an abusive situation, she's in an emergency shelter. What are economic needs? What are the needs in terms of her own skills development or training, let alone children? Because usually shelters think about, okay, where's the nearest school? we need to find schools for the kids, etc. But what about making her an active citizen, giving her the tools so she becomes an active agent in her own life on where she wants to go with this? She may want to go back home, and that's her choice, but it must come from a place where she knows she has options, because her economic recovery has been taken into account. Her social realities, right? So we have to find protective mechanisms in terms of her social realities. The state may need to intervene. If she's living in a village where the village chief is the head and the village chief is the gatekeeper to her accessing social or justice services, the state needs to intervene to say to the gatekeeper, are we going to hold you accountable because she's a citizen, she's entitled to constitutional protection like anyone else. You can't act as a gatekeeper. And so the holistic approach for me is so important. And it isn't about setting up one-stop centers. One-stop centers are wonderful, right? Because a victim goes in and she can see the police, the prosecutor, the social worker, get the therapeutic staff, the justice staff. But it has to go beyond that, because her life is not a little bubble that's going to last, you know. And you have to start thinking, okay, what's the second stage? Where does she go? I was in Afghanistan 2 years ago on mission. And a question that an ambassador asked me is, you know, what do we do? Because the women who come into shelters in Afghanistan stay here for 5 years, and shelters are not meant for 5 years. And I said, what is her option? Because she has no option. Once she leaves home and comes into a shelter, she can never go back home. She'll get killed, right? Because she brought shame and dishonor and whatever the social stigmas are. So what are you, as the donor community, as the international community, as a diplomatic community, what have you been thinking of? If you know that women are staying 5 years in a shelter, and it's not the best of environments to have a whole bunch of people and their children in one place, it's not teaching women any skills about standing on their own feet, about developing their own little space in their home and their economic activities. And I said, in the same way that the UN and the diplomatic community lives in compounds, have you thought about creating a women's compound so that they can support each other, but they have independent living? They then learn how to stand alone on their own 2 feet, raise their children, find ways to sustain themselves. In the shelter, they can't do that because shelters have rules. And shelters monitor women, not all, but quite a few, and we know that there are good and bad shelters throughout the world. So the question I pushed back was, have you thought about second stage housing to create the environment of women becoming more independent? And of course, Afghanistan is at a stage where, you know, all services are highly dependent on donor funding and UN agencies.
And a different type of protection also in terms of the conflict as well. So I'm going to bring us back into this final part of our discussion around moving forward. We ask a lot of women, you know, with the new Sustainable Development Goals now, what is the world you envisage in 2030, given that you've got all these intergovernmental organizations, the UN, the Commonwealth, regional intergovernmental organizations, and member states all committing to Agenda 2030. But as someone who is has seen so closely, almost at that micro level, the impact of violence, when you think about the Agenda 2030, if you were writing the report, what would you like to be writing?
I'd like to be writing that we have effectively and substantively met all our goals in a holistic way. I think when we look at the MDGs, we feel a sense of disappointment in some ways that we had 15 years and the goals were not met. And the question for me then is, why were they not met? Did we do sufficient accountability when we did these reviews, when we received the annual reports? Through what lens did we look at it? How did we then engage and ask, why are there these gaps? 15 years is a long time. Why were we not asking, where are these gaps? What do you need in terms of technical assistance so you can meet your goals? And I would really hate it if in 2030 we sat and we said, it's very disappointing, we haven't achieved goals, blah, 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 you know. And so from the get-go, let's start thinking about accountability and how we do reviews. What are the tools that are needed? So at a civil society level, there's a capacitation going on that says these are each of the goals, these are how they interlink, these are the ones that tie in most closely with women's security, their safety, their bodily integrity. What is it that we need to move beyond checklists, right? So what do we need to analyze? What is the data we need to be gathering? So every year when our governments do the review, we have the shadow report that says, hang on, this is not being met, or and so 15 years down the line is not when we say it's really disappointing that we haven't met this. So for me, that would be, it's the accountability, it's the reviews, but it's also when the reviews take place, what is the role of civil society in asking questions? So officially, they can challenge through shadow reports, my hope is. Unofficially, can they go to the review panel, like the Universal Periodic Review process, and can they ask the questions? And a huge message for me is that when you're analyzing the developments in your country, are you using a human rights lens? Are you looking at the Sustainable Development Goals underpinned by what the normative obligations are? Because we shouldn't get fixated on the Sustainable Development Goals on its own. It's a policy document. It's a consensual document. It's an aspirational document. If we make that the normative, then we lose the human rights. Yes, the argument is that the Sustainable Development Goals are underpinned by human rights norms and standards, but if we examine it closely, we know there are gaps. So how do we take the treaty body system, what's coming out of the UPR, what's coming out of the special procedures mechanisms, how do we take that proven human rights analysis and then ask the question on each goal, are we meeting it? And you're absolutely right about linking 5 and 16, because I think if we don't do that, then we're doing a disservice in the violence against women sector, because then we start thinking about discrimination and equality, and violence is, one of the targets. But we don't see inclusive, safe, secure, and secure societies as underpinning the individual's life, so individual, institutional, structural, and we need to constantly bring those 3 levels together all the time. When I teach, I say to students, because they have this vision of the UN as a savior that can save, and I say the UN is a government of governments, right? We need to understand that, and governments act in their self-interest like human beings do, right? So we have to think of the UN as having interests that may not tie in with the interests of a population, of a subgroup of a population. The rhetoric may be that it is. So how do we take policy documents but interrogate it through a human rights lens?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.